Hey there, and welcome to this month's episode of the Fraternus Forge podcast. This is a forum for young adult Catholic men and women to come together in conversation on topics of faith and morality, for as iron sharpens iron, so one man or woman sharpens another. Really excited that you're here with us this month, really excited to share this episode with you. Our guest this month is Katie Breaux. Katie works in the media landscape here in Nashville, Tennessee, and has a long track record of working in that space, whether it's content creation or publishing. She's lived in New York and LA, has a lot of experience in that area, and it's so good to see like a strong Catholic presence in those areas. So we're really lucky and blessed to have her here on the show this month. And I'm so excited to share this episode with you. It was such a fruitful conversation. We started by talking about the decline of dignity in our culture and the crisis of just meaning that is present in our culture today. We see it from so many different angles, like the cyclical sort of nature of the products that we consume and the culture that creates them, and how those things sort of reinforce each other in this vicious cycle. We talk a little bit about spiking emotions as well, where honestly, I feel like that's at the root of a lot of the evil that we're seeing, where it's, I want something now, and I don't care if it's right or wrong by someone else's standards. I'm just going to go do it because this is what I want. It's what spikes my emotions, etc. And as Catholics, we're called to live counterculturally to that, to be willing to engage in the mundane, the day-to-day. And I know it's not sexy, I know it's not exciting, but that's where God wants to meet us. That is life. We take this mindset, this countercultural mindset, and we shift it in the second half of the podcast into the dating space, where just the process of meeting people that could be or could not be the person that you're supposed to marry. And it's not easy to hear some of the stuff that we talk about in this episode, but it's right and it's true and it's good, and it is the way to life in this area. I feel like there's a lot of really good stuff here. I'm definitely going to be referencing this episode again in the future. And so, yeah, I'm really glad that you're here. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. If you have ideas for what you want to hear us cover in future episodes, I know there's a lot happening in our world right now, or maybe there's something happening in just your world. Like, I have this problem or thing that I've been wrestling with. Please send us those ideas. Really want this to be a forum that's useful to you. Really want to tackle questions that are meaningful to you. So you can send those directly to fraternusforge@gmail.com. That's name of the podcast @gmail.com. You can also send those ideas to me directly if you're in the Young Adult Catholic Group Me or one of the smaller offshoots here in town. My name is Mathew McCloskey. You can look me up, send me those ideas. I would love to hear from you. Yeah, that's it for now. Again, really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you for being here. Let's jump into it.
Well, I think most people who are moving here are moving for that reason.
Yeah.
And it's, people definitely are nice here. It reminds me of Texas in that way, but then having moved from Texas to New York and then New York to California, I really appreciated in New York that it's sort of what you see is what you get. There's no falsity, there's no theater about kindness, you know?
Oh, sure.
And then in California, especially living in LA, it was very like, people would be very nice on the surface, but there was often, more times than not, there was an ulterior motive to that kindness. You know, it didn't have much depth to it. And there are always exceptions, but just by and large, comparing those two places. And so now here in Tennessee, one thing I noticed is that most people, like, they're kind just for the sake of being kind. Like, it's just part of the culture, you know? So, yeah.
It's kind of crazy how that sort of, and I know what you're talking about. It's kind of crazy how that can, like, sort of become, like, the average, or, like, it becomes, like, a metro area sort of takes on a certain character, like, the culture takes on a certain character.
Yeah, completely.
That's so cool how that can, like, happen. Because I think otherwise I might be like, oh, they're just humans, like, doing their thing. Like, how could one person's behavior, and this might actually slide into our topics for today, but, like, how can one person's behavior, like a group of people's behavior, sort of influence the behavior of the whole? Because like, they're all different temperaments and they all have different values. How can suddenly, you know what I'm saying?
Right, yeah. Well, maybe it's like a little bit of osmosis too, you know? You kind of just subconsciously pick up on the behaviors that are around you, or I don't know, maybe it's a chicken or the egg situation. Like, Nashville is drawing a particular type of person to come here, you know? Especially now, as the places we live sort of become more and more polarized, you know, and people are moving to states to reflect the political policies that they want to see enacted. And just a quality of life, you know, having lived in California for a few years, like, the quality of life there just was on a steady decline for quite a while.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. I guess that those things kind of like support each other, where it's like we are seeing that people voting with their feet type of idea, where it's like if you have more progressive ideologies, you're probably more drawn to a California or a New York. And those ideologies come along with like a certain temperament and a certain value set, versus if you're more conservative, you're probably drawn to a Texas or a Tennessee or somewhere in like the Southeast. And those values come along with like a certain temperament, and people are committed to that. And when you move for that reason, then I feel like people are more committed to like, this is why I moved here. This is the culture that I want to help support. Is that what you're getting at?
I think so. Being from Texas, like being raised in Texas, but my mother is from New Hampshire, so our house always sort of felt like a New England Irish Catholic house.
Oh, interesting.
In Texas. And, you know, I always wanted to live in New York from a very young age. So despite being raised in a Catholic home, and Texas is much more of a culture of Christianity than a New York or LA was. And when I first moved, I sort of wondered and worried, would my faith be tested? Would my values be tested? And if anything, they became stronger. My faith became stronger living in extremely secular places, because you almost, it's more of a choice. You have to live sort of counterculturally. And then you find your community of people who are also living that way.
Counterculturally.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. It's almost like, no, I won't say it's almost like, it is exactly persecution. Not to the extent that like the early church fathers were persecuted, but like people hate the church and like want nothing to do with the church. And so to say that I'm Catholic, especially in a city like New York, is like, you're inviting people to be like, so why should a bunch of old white men make the rules? Which I think is a dumb argument, but that's another story.
Was it Fulton Sheen who said that so many people think they hate the Catholic Church, but it's so many people misunderstand the church? I'm probably misquoting him.
That sounds like something he would say. Yeah. I buy that.
Yeah. All right. We'll go with it.
You heard it here first. Fulton Sheen. So one of the things that I wanted to, or I guess we sort of talked about, like the genesis of this podcast is like the decline of dignity in our culture. I know we've talked a little bit about it in sort of the intro. What comes to mind when you hear that phrase? Like, what are sort of the indicators? Because I agree with you. I think our culture is on a decline, but I want to give you the opportunity to.
What comes to mind when I hear the word dignity?
Or just like decline of dignity in our culture, or both of those?
I definitely agree with you. I think we are certainly witnessing a decline in dignity in our culture. And, you know, in terms of, I think we talked a little bit about this before, but the way we dress, the way we speak, the content we consume, you know, and it's the whole garbage in, garbage out. If you consume entertainment, media, music that is not infused with dignity and not uplifting the dignity of the human person, of course that's going to affect your mindset. And then that's going to affect the things that you create and put into the culture, you know. And we talked about it being that sort of endless feedback loop. Did we talk about that?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think so.
Okay.
And when you say endless feedback loop, you're talking about between media and the people that consume it.
Right.
Culture and the people.
And people. Yeah. So I came across that. It was a very old article. I think it's from the early 2000s, but this team of, I guess, social psychologists did a research project where they took American novels that were written from like the early 1900s to 2000, and they codified the virtue language within it. So words like courage, sacrifice, humility, honesty, compassion, and they measured the occurrence of those words within the books, and they found a steady decline of virtue words, and then they found a steady increase of words related to the self and to the ego. And at the time of this study, they said, you know, a fair assumption or a fair hypothesis would not be that we would witness a complete absence of virtue in our culture, but that we would arrive at a state of moral confusion. And that feels like where we are now. It's very difficult to, pick your issue A, B, or C. It's very difficult to sit across the table from someone. And, when you have different definitions of what is good, and now even different definitions of what is true with a capital T, and now it's all about live your own truth. There is no objective truth. And how do you arrive at a point of compromise when you can't even agree on what is true?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I like a lot of what you said in terms of like compromise and like the speak your truth sort of thing. I feel like part of the reason that we got to this point where it's very difficult, in some cases impossible, to sit across the table from someone who has an opposing viewpoint. I think part of the reason that we've gotten here is because there has been so much compromise. And I think, like, my dad used to say this, and I think he got it from somewhere else. It was like, in the essentials, unity; in the non-essentials, charity; and in all things... No, it's in the essentials, unity; in the non-essentials, diversity; and in all things, charity.
Okay. And so what would you qualify as essential and non-essential?
So, like, great question. So, like, essential, I would talk about, like, the dignity of a human person, the value of a human life, sexuality, war, things like that, personal property, freedom of speech. Those are essentials. Versus non-essentials are like, what color car do you drive?
Yeah.
Like, that's a blue car. That's fine. And like, I would have to think of something else but you get the idea. Yeah. Actually, fiscal policy is a good example. Like, some people think that we should have a bigger government. Some people think we should have a smaller government. I'm pretty convinced that a smaller government is a better way to go, and I have my reasons for thinking that, but there are people who think that a bigger government is the way to go, and they have their reasons for thinking that.
Right.
That I would consider a non-essential, kind of teetering on the edge of becoming an essential, because there's implications as to policies. But anyway, I think that what's happened is we've seen that non-essentials diversity mindset bleed into the essential territory. People are like, oh, live and let live, for so long. And now we're seeing the fruits of that, where people are just like, well, this is my truth. You can't question my truth.
Yeah.
You know that one scene in The Incredibles where, like, someone's like, everyone's special, which is another way of saying that nobody is. But it's like, everyone's truth counts, which is another way of saying that nobody's truth counts. And I think the fruits that we're seeing now are a result of that. Does that track? What do you think?
That definitely does. Yeah, it definitely does. And I think it's also, when you just look at human nature, you know, oftentimes perception is reality. And it's like when you have a disagreement with someone or a miscommunication with someone, you're often perceiving their intentions that they didn't mean, you know, and so for you, that's real, that's true. But and that remains reality to you unless you go to that person and say, hey, here's what I think happened. What did you actually mean? You know, and unless you're willing to talk to people and to disagree with the dignity of the other person in mind, you know. But, you know, when we live in a culture that doesn't even honor the dignity of human life from the womb, you know, so it's, we're now living in a culture that by and large does not respect the dignity of human life. And if we can't even talk about when human life begins, which is at conception, where do we go from there?
That's, I know we could talk for a while on that. I just will say that I 1,000% agree with you that it is at conception.
I just wanted to get into the hot button issues just right away, Mathew.
I'm 100% here for it. You know I'm here for it, Katie. 100%. Like, it's another episode that I'd love to go like a little more in depth on. Like, having answers to these questions and having answers to some of like the, I'll just be real, nonsense that gets said when topics like that are brought up. Because I think, coming back to the idea of compromise, we need to like call evil for what it is and being willing to stand up and say, no, that's wrong. Like, you are killing someone. Like the viability argument is one that I got hit with the other day. It was like, oh, you know, a fetus isn't viable up until like a certain point in the mother's womb. And I'm like, that's why it's in the mother's womb.
Yeah.
Like it needs mom. Like take your newborn baby. Like let's say your friend has a baby. Like, is that baby viable away from mom? Like,
Right. Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like does its non-viability justify me taking its life away?
Yeah.
Oh, this baby is not viable away from mom. Like if I put it in the street, it's going to die.
Yeah.
Therefore, I can dispose of it as I see fit. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's these lies that have so permeated our culture and ruined lives inside of it. You know, it's this lie that abortion is freedom and that a baby is a burden to a woman. You know, the ability to have a human life inside of your womb, that is the most divine gift. That is the most divine power, and it's within our very nature. You know, it's and what a terrible lie to have been to have inflicted itself on our society, you know, and even with so many controversial topics now with relation to gender and everything that's going on in our society now, it's like the loving position is to speak the truth to people with compassion and kindness and tenderness, you know, and I think it's just our society has become so overly emotional that whenever you just say the true thing,
people flip it.
It's really hard to hear, and sometimes the truth is hard to hear. That's just real.
Yeah. A friend of mine, Daniel, said this recently. It's like if I'm standing on the edge of a cliff and I'm like, I'm gonna jump off. Yeah. Like, what's her name from Kate Winslet? Titanic. I'm gonna jump off. I'm king of the world. And Katie, you're like, Matt, that's a cliff. You're gonna die, and you wrestle me back from the edge. It might hurt a little bit getting wrestled back from the edge, but I was gonna die or experience something far worse than being wrestled back from that edge. Yeah. And so being willing to, and like, here's the thing, like we're talking about things that people are saying. We're using words. I've used words like nonsense and we've called them lies and things like that. And that's what they are. But I really like what you said about showing up with compassion and empathy and being like, because yelling at someone is not going to change their heart. No. And speaking the truth to them in a kind way isn't necessarily going to change their heart, but it's your best bet. Yeah.
And I think it's a question of how do we love people? Because that's what we're called to do. We're called to love people. And, you know, Jesus was kind and tender and soft, but he also spoke the truth. He also condemned what was wrong. When it, you know, he also condemned what was deserving of condemnation, but he did it by leading with love. And I think that's what's so missing. You know, whenever someone's sitting behind a screen, it's really easy to type in all caps at some stranger. You know, it's a lot harder to sit at a dinner table with someone and look them in the eye and respectfully disagree, you know, and still lead with compassion and lead with vulnerability. But it goes back to, again, the dignity of the human person, which is inherent and equal in all of us. But if we're not leading with that, then it's difficult to have those conversations.
It's an even more uphill battle. Yeah. It's no longer an uphill battle. It's like, I'm trying to climb a wall, which is just, I'm not Spider-Man. I can't do that. I 100% agree with you. And we've touched on a couple of things too that I'd love to unpack more. I know you mentioned a second ago, like the sort of cyclical nature of this increased emotion, folks holding on to lies that we're sort of tasked with through the Spirit, sort of combating in these acts of love and kindness where we like refute lies. Can you say a little bit more about that and how that works so people have a better sense of what we mean when we say the cyclical nature of consumer products and people that consume them?
Yeah, I think, you know, when we say it's cyclical, like you can imagine a circle. Like the people within a culture create cultural products. So books, movies, music, art, advertising, you know, consumer goods. And then those products by and large shape the people, you know, and so it becomes this sort of endless feedback loop. And in many ways we are educated by culture, and it's part of why we spoke about this a little bit before, but it's part of why we have to be so careful about what we allow ourselves to engage with and consume, because, you know, thoughts become things. and what you do allow, you know, you get to decide what you allow into your life. You get to decide what you allow your eyes to see and your ears to hear. And if we ask the question of, is this honoring the dignity of the human person? And if the answer is no, then get out of there.
Right. 100%.
Yeah. And that's not to say like we have to sit around watching, you know, Hallmark movies all the time, right? Like we can still objectively consume art as long as we understand what is good and true and beautiful.
Yes, 100%. I love the way that you put that, where it's like, these are ideas and they sort of shape us.
Yeah.
Like culture teaches us and what we consume teaches us. I've thought about it recently as like, have you seen The Matrix?
Once a very long time ago. I'm not a...
I know it's kind of a Breaux
red pill, blue
movie.
pill, whatever.
Yeah, you know the essentials.
I got the thing,
yeah. So you know how in that movie, like the way that they get into the Matrix is they sort of have that plug in the back of their head.
Okay.
So there's a couple of scenes just sort of supports this idea of culture shaping us, where like Keanu Reeves needs to learn how to fly a helicopter.
Okay.
So they, through the plug, just like they download a program into his brain. It takes like a minute or two, and he's like, I know Kung Fu, or I can fly a helicopter or something like that.
Wouldn't it be nice?
Wouldn't it be nice, right? Wouldn't it be nice? But same thing, where it's like you hear something and it's programming. Like it's literally taking your brain, taking your heart, and like shifting your vision and your interactions with the world.
Yeah.
And if those are aimed in a downward direction, then your approach to the world is going to be like your trajectory is tilted downwards.
And I think we have to pay attention to what is habitual as well, you know, because that change happens over time, and it's, you know, you can use those habits to your good or to your detriment. Like it's it's the whole choose your hard thing, you know? So whether it's with physical health, emotional health, mental health, your relationships, all of that happens over time. And it's like, it's the coins that we're putting in that bank, right? And so we can choose to climb uphill, and in all of those avenues, it's going to be hard, but it's also going to be hard if you allow yourself to just roll down that hill in a steady decline.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And that's like, you're getting at something important here too, where it's like, and this kind of comes back to what we said earlier about confronting the lies that we're faced with. Like, to take no stance or to make no choice is still a choice.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of times we're choosing like compliance. We're choosing to just absorb, oh, that's just culture. It's just, that's something I hear a lot. Do you hear people just say, oh, it's just songs?
Yeah.
Oh, it's just movies.
I mean, what a blasé attitude. Yeah. I don't know that I don't know that I hear people articulate it, but I think it is just a general mindset that, you know, and it's sort of easy to check out from things we feel like we don't have control over, you know? Yeah, but we live in such a, you know, media is so a part of our daily lives in a way that I don't think it was even probably like 30, 40, 50 years ago for people. Because we've got that, you know, that computer in our pocket all day long, just pummeling us with noise, you know? And it's really easy to just let that become a constant, you know, to let that noise just never stop.
Yeah. That's, ooh. You're hitting on something important here.
Okay.
I think when we talk about noise and its relation to the spiritual life, those two are clearly in conflict. And I think I have an idea as to like what the nature of that conflict is, but I'm having like a hard time articulating it here. Could you maybe say a little more about
how the noise sort of collides with the peace of a spiritual life?
Yeah.
I mean, I think silence can be incredibly powerful, you know, and it's really easy to just have noise on constantly and distract ourselves from the burden of human consciousness, but we're going to have to face it one day or another. There's this playwright, David Mamet, in his, masterclass.
I do know David Mamet.
Yeah.
He's got glasses, right?
I think so.
Yeah, okay.
I'll quote him poorly, but to paraphrase him, he basically says that, both with drama and religion, that is how we can try to unburden ourselves from the burden of consciousness. And so with story, that helps us understand this sort of gift and burden of being human, because we do have consciousness in a way that animals don't, right? Like we do have to contemplate the grand questions of what is meaning, like what is the purpose of this life? What is my purpose here? And that's an enormous question, and in one that it might be tempting to run away from and just turn on the latest podcast or,
right,
song or movie or whatever it is.
Don't want to think about.
Don't even get me started on social media.
I love how you put that.
Yeah.
It's like a distraction.
Yeah.
Where it's like, have you seen The Good Place?
Yeah.
So that one scene where like Michael kind of has a crisis and he gets the white suit and the sports car and he's like, we just got to keep moving. We just got to keep moving. If I stop moving, I'll start thinking. Like, same thing.
Yeah.
Where it's like there's an uncomfortable truth. Like, I read this in a book recently. It was a more secular book, but there was still a lot of really good stuff in it. It was called Everything is F-Word, Ed.
Yeah.
That's by Mark Manson, awesome author.
Okay.
Don't agree with him on everything, but he said that the two uncomfortable truths that everyone is always running from are that you and everybody that you love is going to die, and little to nothing that you do is going to matter. He says on like an infinite scale, meaning like this life and the next life.
Right. Like most of us aren't going to make it to the history books.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I like to rephrase it as like little to nothing that you do is going to matter on a secular level or like a worldly level. And that's a lot. And like, I'll add one more in there. This is from 12 Rules for Life. Like, life is tragic and difficult. And it doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what circumstances you were born into, you're going to wrestle with tragedy.
Yeah.
You're going to wrestle with pain and suffering.
But suffering is inevitable, and suffering, it's inescapable, and it's also beautiful. It's in our suffering that we can, and this is from a specifically Christian and Catholic perspective, it's in our suffering that we can bond ourselves to Christ, and suffer with the King who suffered for us, and yeah, there's Arthur Brooks said something similar. Okay, so he says, if it feels good, do it, has shifted to if it feels bad, make it stop. And if you want to find purpose and meaning in life, then you need to suffer. Meaning requires suffering, and therefore suffering is sacred. And that, pleasure is limbic. Like that is, pleasure is just an effect of happiness. Happiness is actually contentment. And you can't stay at this, this dopamine surge all the time. You have to go back to homeostasis. You have to go back to those mundane days, And again, like that, a life of contentment is cultivated day after day after day in our habits and in our practices, and what we allow into our lives and what we say yes to and what we say no to.
Oh my gosh, there's so many threads that I like want to pull on here. You just phrased that really, really beautifully. It's
Arthur Brooks phrased that really beautifully.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Katie. Yeah, I totally agree. So I went to an electronic music festival, and this is all to showcase this idea. Yeah, exactly. Literally that. Like, I think if I had $1 for every time that weekend I heard like let's get funky.
This is a whole new side of you, Mathew, that I
it's not me.
not know existed.
It's not me. My brother and his wife love this festival. It's called Electric Forest. If you're curious in knowing the name of the festival. I never
want to go. Tell me more about it.
Yeah, I was glad for the experience, but there was a lot of sin there, which we'll get into. But like, it sort of goes to showcase this duality. It is good and evil.
Yeah.
It is healthy versus unhealthy. What you're putting forward, and you tell me if I'm stating this accurately, it's like life is mundane. It's not possible to stay just blissed out, like,
Yeah.
I'm having an amazing, like, just surge of pleasure all the time.
Right.
It's not realistic to stay there. And in order to cultivate true happiness, it requires showing up and engaging with our life as it is on a moment-to-moment basis. And also choosing the things that, like, matter to us and pursuing truth and things like that.
Yeah. And it's what we do day after day in the Screw Tape Letters. We just going back to the way that we regard other people and the way we honor the dignity of the human person in others. C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters talks about malice versus benevolence, you know, and you can probably look up the quote, Screw Tape Letters, malice, benevolence.
Okay.
And he basically says, you know, when it comes to benevolence, make sure that, and we should say the premise of Screw Tape Letters is that this, you know, demon essentially is working to win the soul of one young man for the devil versus for God, who he refers to as the enemy in the book, and it's a satire. Anyway, so talking about malice versus benevolence, he says, when it comes to benevolence, make sure that, you know, your subject reserves all of that for people that are far away, and keep the malice reserved for the people he meets every day. And eventually the malice becomes real and the benevolence becomes wholly imaginary, you know, and so people will post, you know, whatever stupid stuff online supporting one cause or another, but how are you treating people in your day-to-day life? How are you treating the cashier at the grocery store? How do you treat your family and your friends and your coworkers? Like, that's what's real. And of course, support causes you believe in. Of course, use your voice for things that you believe to be right and true and good, and defend what you believe needs defending. But also, how are we treating people in our day-to-day lives? Because that's what's real, and that is what is a reflection of our interior. That's the reflection of our soul.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Just love that. 100% agree.
Yeah.
It's like, I saw a lot of that just coming back to, like, the music festival. This example of, like, well, I actually experienced this in my own life too, where it's really easy to be kind to strangers. Like, I have a bad habit of being kind of a performer. Or actually, you know what? Like, it's a strength and a weakness. Every strength is also a weakness.
How so?
So one of my strengths, have you taken Strengths Finder? Have you ever taken that, like, test?
No.
It's a fun one. It's just like, it's another thing, kind of like Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or something like that.
Got it. Yeah.
And in this case, they give you 5 strengths, like things that you're good at.
Okay.
And one of mine is woo. And woo is like, I like winning people over.
You like wooing people?
I like wooing people, yeah.
Right, you're wooing me right now, Matthew.
Cheers. It's natural skill.
Yeah.
And it's just like meeting somebody and being able to, like, find some common ground with them, win them over, be funny, be engaged, all that stuff. Like, I enjoy that process.
Yeah.
But part of it, and I'll tie this into the music festival, which then ties into what you just said about, like, benevolence versus malice. It's really easy for me to drift into this state where I'm putting forward a front because I want some sort of result, as opposed to, like, being vulnerable. Like, hey, this is who I actually am. Like, if I was who I actually am, like, all the time, I don't know that I would say all that much, because who I actually am doesn't really talk all that much.
But I don't know. I give yourself a break, because I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing, to try to give the best of yourself to people that you meet, you know? It's like when we're going through a hard time, do we tell every person we meet at Starbucks, like, our woes and worries? No.
That's fair.
Like, we reserve those for very specific people, and I think it's good to want to give the best of yourself to people, to leave people that you're interacting with better than you found them.
Okay.
You know, I don't think that's a bad thing.
Appreciate it.
And yeah, I mean, we all kind of perform in a way. We start learning how to do that, like, you know, from the time we're sentient, I guess, you know?
That's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. And I also have a bad habit of being too hard on myself, like I'm sure many of us do.
Did your strengths test tell you that?
It did not tell me that. Yeah. That was strengths, not weaknesses. Okay. We're being positive and focusing on strengths.
I don't want to do the weakness test. I feel pretty bad about myself. But
I, like, agree with you. Like, it is it is helpful to a point.
Uh-huh.
But then there are circumstances, and I felt a lot of this at the festival, and I have felt that benevolence versus malice, where it's like, in the LGB alphabet soup community, we'll just use that as an example, I see a lot of emphasis placed on positivity and benevolence and like, oh, just treat people really well. And I'm sure people like mean well, but I also feel like there's sin. And I feel like benevolence is a really easy cover for sin, just the way that it was sort of laid out in the Screw Tape Letters. And if I yell at a telemarketer or yell at my roommate who I see every day, I might want to be like, oh, that's not...
He seems like a nice guy. I don't know why.
He's a good dude. I like Derek. But it's like, it's the same thing where it's like, I'm trying to cover something. That's where like the benevolence being like a performance. That's what I was really trying to get to. Does that make sense?
I think it's also, this is touching on something different, but I remember one Sunday, Father Fry, was talking about righteous anger. And he said sometimes anger, again, I'm paraphrasing a gifted priest, but basically anger can be justified, but it's a question of what does that anger move you to do? It's a question of how do you act? Once you register, there is, a righteous anger sort of roiling within you. Anger at injustice is properly placed. But then what do you do with that? And it goes back to leading with love and leading with compassion, but still telling the truth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that could be injustice in society at large, but then that could also be like injustice like within your home. Like I need to be able to tell the truth about myself.
Yeah.
And the things that I've done wrong if I'm going to like make progress in those areas.
Right. Yeah, so when your roommate doesn't do the dishes, like that anger's justified. But what are you going to do with it?
Yeah. Hey, listen, I would love it if you washed some dishes.
Yeah.
Something else that we have here in our notes. So like the picture that we painted so far is of a culture that is like very relativistic, interested in spiking endorphins, and we as Catholics have taken like a countercultural stance to that, and pursuing the mundane and like showing up and engaging with our life as it is. But I don't believe that, like, what I'm ultimately building to is like, how do we engage with pleasure if it's not like our end goal? Because I know some people, I've experienced this, where they see and can recognize the instant gratification, the give me that dopamine trend that our culture's on, and they're like, I want nothing to do with music. I want nothing to do with movies. I don't know if God exists, but he seems like a pretty cruel and heartless person, or heartless being. So we know that's not true too.
Right. The people who don't engage with culture, I think that's fine. That's not me.
Yeah.
I think culture is an incredibly powerful tool, and I can read a book or admire a work of art and not necessarily agree with the point of view, every point of view of the author, or or say I'm reading a novel. I don't have to agree with the decisions that the characters are making, right? That would be a pretty boring book, because where would the conflict be?
Yeah.
And I just, as someone who's grown up sort of steeped in culture and steeped in the arts and has a deep love for story, I can't imagine just completely disengaging from that. That's fine for people who do, and if that's their solution, more power to them. But I have no interest in sort of, going to live on a commune and churning butter and not watching movies anymore. Like, is that what they do on communes? They churn butter? I don't know.
Back in the 18th century, things were so much better.
I'm looking for notes that I took at. Did you go to that Theology of the Body thing they had at Cathedral like a few months ago?
I did. Yeah, I did go to that. Okay. That was really good.
Okay, so you'll remember when he was talking about pleasure, And he said, whenever you completely deny earthly pleasures, that's Puritanism. And then when you completely only indulge earthly pleasure, if that's your end goal, that is addiction. But when you take a divine approach to the earthly pleasures that God has given us, and you point those toward heaven, that's the journey to sainthood. And so I think so again, for the people who completely disengage from that, fine. But there is pleasure in consumption of art. There is pleasure in earthly things, but we just have to approach them with a divine mindset and understand them as gifts from God. And that's, again, like a struggle of being human. Like it's not like an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
But it is something I think we have to do consciously.
Definitely.
Yeah. And that's also part of the beauty of our faith, Even look at a mass, like you go to Latin mass for the smells and bells, like those are earthly pleasures, right? They're beautiful, but they're pointed toward the divine.
Yeah. I remember that moment in the talk. Actually, that was one of the most striking moments. He sort of had that picture talking about Puritanism and addiction and then like sainthood. He had this painting. This is a Christopher West talk. He had this painting that his daughter did up on the display or whatever. And there were 3 sort of drawings of the same guy and the Stoic. They all had a fire in their hearts or some sort of like laser or whatever that was trying to get out. And the Stoic had his hands over his heart, and so he was just kind of like stifling it.
Yeah.
And then the addict had his his chest exposed, but like the laser was pointing downwards.
Yeah.
And he was like, he had this sort of like kind of hungry, greedy look on his face. But then the saint had his chest pointed upwards, and like the fire was lifting him skywards. And I thought that was just like a really beautiful.
Yeah.
Even that was, I don't know, like being like the beauty of that art. Like somebody made that, but God made the person who made that.
Yeah.
Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like this whole thing segues really well into, and I'd love that you put this in the show notes, allowing ourselves to be romanced by Jesus.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's something that I've seen you do just a really good job
Thank you.
with in some of the practices in your spiritual life and your day-to-day. Can you talk a little bit about those and what it means to be romanced by Jesus?
Well, over the last few years, I started choosing a word to start the year off and sort of influence my mindset for the year. And so last year, my word was romance. And it was, I don't know, like a frilly page in my journal dedicated to this, but I'm trying to remember. And it was creating a romantic atmosphere in my home, like making it beautiful. Making it a place where I like to host people and have friends over for dinner or for our Bible study, and so cultivating a romantic aura by making a beautiful home and then carrying that kind of energy with me into daily life. And that just involves like appreciating the small things, like allowing a cup of coffee to be truly savored, moving through the world slowly. I think there was sort of like a trend with this online where people are romanticizing their life. But, whenever that started sort of entering the zeitgeist, I remember reading about it and I was like, so just the way I live, cool. It's a great way to go through life.
Yeah.
But also allowing, this is another Father Fight, whenever he said, allow yourself to be romanced by Jesus. And, the more that I started to go to adoration, the more I was like, wow, like this is a really special time that I look forward to. And do we always deeply feel that emotion? No. But we still honor the obligation of Mass. And again, the habitual act of worshiping God. And then it just makes those moments when it does click and you go, oh my gosh, like I get to sit here before the mystery of the universe. Pretty romantic.
It's pretty cool, yeah.
And, another priest, I think this is Father O'Neill, said to me, he talked to me about totus tuus, like, Jesus, I'm totally yours. It's pretty romantic, and then that allows us, when we have that mindset of just understanding that there is, the creator of the universe loves you uniquely, and knows you uniquely. With that in mind, like, how do we not romanticize our lives here on earth, you know?
Yeah, when
Yeah.
each sort of circumstance or like your temperament is sort of shaped in a way, and you as a person is shaped in a way to respond to different things.
Yeah.
Or like God made creatures who make paintings,
Mm-hmm.
who make trap beats, or whatever the case may be, whatever floats your boat.
Yeah.
Like, that's cool. And like all of that is part of the mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of God being like, hey, I love you, you know?
So what is that? I said what it looks like for me as a woman to sort of create beauty, to create little pockets of beauty in my home, beautiful experiences for the people in my life. Like, so a lot of it is tied to like making life beautiful. What does that look like for you?
Oh, that's a good question. What does God romanticizing me look like?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I am, what's the right word? Captivated isn't the right word, but I'm
It's
like
a good word though.
thoroughly engaged by beauty. I feel like captivated implies like some sort of slave sort of nature. And
Okay.
like beauty is definitely very compelling, and if I had the wrong kind of relationship with it, it could probably captivate me. But that leads more towards like addiction, and I'm just calling that out. But yeah, I'm like very much engaged and motivated by beauty. Like hikes are awesome to like get, and it's weird to step into a forest and be like, wow, there's no sidewalk here.
Yeah.
There's no Hattie B's, and there's no cars, and there's no deadlines. It's just trees. And I can say what a tree is, Katie, but like, do I know what a tree is? I can say what a tree does. Oh, it takes water and nutrients from the ground, and it grows tall and grows leaves and photosynthesis, and like, but do I know what a tree does? That sort of like mystery element is also really fascinating, because it's like, I think truth is really interesting too, where it's like, there's only so much that my mind can grasp. And so when I like hit a point where I'm just like, whoa, I can't even, what? Like, the universe does what? That doesn't even make sense. How is that possible?
Yeah.
There's a quote from a G.K. Chesterton book have you read Orthodoxy?
No.
It's a good one. If you like Chesterton, it's a good one. But he talks about how the religious person comes up to the sea of infinity and just allows himself to like float in it. Versus like the scientist wants to put boundaries on infinity and they can't do it. And that's what drives like a lot of very sane, logical people crazy, because, there must be an explanation for this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And how do we balance the emotion with the reason? And with it, with our faith too.
Yeah.
Like, you can go to one of these non-denominational churches where they have this beautiful music, and it is very emotionally moving, and that's not to knock what they're doing there at all, but part of what I love about our Catholic faith is the combination of those two, and that it is about the truth, but it's also about the reverence of beauty in the church, and it's about the emotion, but also the reason.
Yeah. I feel like that balance between those two is really important. I'm looking at another thing that you wrote here in the notes, being in the world but not of it. And I feel like that's a really good, that I feel like those are the same idea, where it's in the world is, wow, there's a lot of beauty here, and I like love being romanced by that beauty, but then not of it is, but I'm still God's, and this, like, my destiny is unity with God in heaven, and these are reminders of that destiny.
Yeah, and that's like, we know how to name that longing within us, that it's a longing for heaven that we can't get here on earth, and we can get little glimpses of it, we can dip our toe into it. And God does give us glimpses of it, but we'll be longing for it until we get there. Hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah, I sure hope so. You know, that's something like I love how you phrase that.
One day.
Right. Like something that I'm really looking forward to, Katie, is just like getting on the other side and being like, wow, that was crazy. Thank you for being part of that podcast. Like, and, oh, look, we helped some people. Look at that. Like, yeah, 100% feel that. So we've talked a decent amount about like, so how does that relationship with beauty and logic sort of show up in the dating space? Because I feel like if there's one area where beauty and truth and vocation and all of that sort of collides, like and also like the suffering, because there's disappointment and there's rejection and there's fear and all that stuff. It all sort of collides in this one spot. How does what we've been talking about sort of play in?
Well, I mean, I think we can also go back to the dignity of the human person. Like going on a date with someone, show up with that person's dignity in mind and at the forefront. And that doesn't mean like you can go on a first date and realize, well, I never want to do that with that person again, right? Like, but still have their dignity in mind and at the forefront of the way that you show up and the way that you treat them. And I think in the modern dating culture now, so much of that has been lost because of what dating apps have done to us as a whole, you know, and it's just created like a sort of fickleness, a sort of superficiality, a lack of intentionality in dating, because, you know, you're looking at an app, just swiping photos. It doesn't feel like a real person on the other end of that. But I don't know, so many people have forgotten how to just show up in their actual lives, like that. There's less and less like meeting at a coffee shop, you know, or meeting a stranger like out in the actual world. And, you know, I understand, I'm sure you can tell me from conversations with men, like, I think for women, we're always like, man, like, why don't guys approach you like in real life? You know, none of us want to be online dating or dating on dating apps. But then I don't want to dismiss how much courage that takes for a man to approach a woman in real life. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that men by their nature do desire risk. You know, like you want to risk something because there's a reward on the other end of that. And, you know, to ask a woman out, you used to have to cross the room and do it. You used to have to pick up the phone and call her and hope she would say yes. And now with a dating app, it's like, well, you matched. There's no risk.
Nice. Good job.
So like how does that create a desire for you to pursue if
you didn't
the risk is already removed?
Yeah, that's, ooh. So what you're saying is like the risk and the uncertainty and the potential for pain is part of what makes women desirable. Like, ooh, she's attractive, and I feel like the desire or like the interest to go say something. And if I can get over that, if I can get through that, it's sort of like I've slain a minor dragon on the way over, and like suddenly this whole experience is worth more than it otherwise would be. Right. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, totally. Okay. And I think women want to be pursued in the real world. You know, like we said, nobody wants to be on those apps. Like they're so terrible. And so, you know, people aren't products, people aren't commodities, and those apps do something really tricky in that they present people as products. And so I don't know, the more that we can all do a better job of showing up in our lives, and even when it comes to flirting, like, my gosh, just practice flirting. Like when you're ordering your coffee, like flirt a little bit. Like, you know what I mean? What do you probably make someone's day better. Yeah,
and that's, I agree with you, and I do feel like a big part of the equation that's broken right now is it is our inability, lack of experience, or clumsiness in dealing with in-person interactions. And it's like, and it also kind of comes back to that idea of like, if it's painful, make it stop. It's really easy, and not to condone anything that guys are doing or not doing. Just speaking from my own perspective, and I wager that some other guys' experience is similar. We'll come back to flirting. I do want to talk about flirting. I think I read this in a book recently. It was the same Mark Manson book.
Okay.
Where he talked about, there's this like Buddhist proverb or something like that, where there's two arrows. Like the first arrow that hits you is your pain.
Okay.
Like it could be disappointment, it could be physical pain, it could be whatever. But then the second arrow that can hit you is the meaning that you assign to that pain. So like take dating, for example. It's painful. I'm not saying like we still need to do this. Guys, we still need to do this. I'm looking at my microphone. Like
I can attest to this.
We still need to do this. But it's challenging because because I've done this. Like I've walked across the room and I've put myself out there and I have tried to engage someone that I was interested in and I've bounced off, meaning that she wasn't available to engage. I didn't get the result that I wanted. She just went off to the bathroom after like, oh yeah, whatever, and just kind of went off. That's disappointing in and of itself, by itself. But then there's the meaning that our brains, and this is the thing I think we need to do a better job of, is being like, the meaning that might get assigned is, wow, I suck.
Yeah.
Like the fact that that was the result.
Perception is reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Versus like, hey, this is just part of the game. I don't know what she's going through. Yeah, that sucked. Yeah, that was disappointing, but like, let's try again.
Yeah. And you're stronger for having done it. Because next time you want to cross the room to talk to a different girl, it's going to be easier. Right. Because you've done it before. You know, it's that habit. And I think just having, for women, I think it's a posture of openness and receptivity. And like, what a compliment to her. You crossed the room to talk to her, you know, and her loss, you know.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's just what do you do with that? And just know, like, we're all just trying to find one person, you know, like and it's all of these people that every room you cross, every girl you talk to, like she's leading you toward your wife. Yeah. So learn something from that interaction. You know, you're being shaped and prepared in that way for the person who's right for you.
Yeah, that's because 99.99% of people are not going to be your future spouse. But that doesn't mean, to your point, that you don't like just, oh yeah, well they're not the person I'm going to marry, so why would I talk to them? It's like, there's something to be learned and something to be gained in that.
Yeah. To quote one of the great philosophers of our time, Taylor Swift, she has a song called All the Girls You Loved Before, and it's like writing to her beloved, saying like, all those girls that you loved in the past, like they led you here to me. They made you into this man that I love now. You know, I love you more than they did. But like,
darn tootin'.
Yeah, but like, wow, how great that, you know, you were led here to me. And from every, like, there's going to be disappointment, there's going to be rejection, there's going to be suffering, but man, like when you have a crush, it's kind of like a delicious kind of suffering, you know, it's like wonderful and terrible at the same time.
Like, come on.
Yeah, like when your heart is woken up by someone and you go, oh yeah, like
I remember what that feels like.
Yeah.
I remember, I won't go into all of the details here, but I just remember an experience like that. And it's just like, it's so wild. Like, yeah, there really is nothing like it. Like, I don't know that I can point to another experience where it's like, this person gets it. Yeah. And I like this person, you know, as opposed to like, oh, you know, this person's good on paper. I feel like that sort of dance happens all the time.
It does. And I think maybe it depends. I think it is largely dependent on personality too, like whether you're more pragmatic or more romantic. It definitely, I think it some people can be more pragmatic with dating. You know, it is more about checking boxes. Sure. Where for someone who's more romantic, it's like, and you'll hear, you know, dating experts say like, oh, chemistry that's not real. Like, you know, the spark isn't real. I tend to think it is. And it can't be all chemistry. It can't be all spark, but it's that feeling of like when you meet someone who's like, okay, like you.
Yeah, this person.
Yeah. It's that feeling of like someone who is both unknown to you, like a bit of a stranger and a bit of a mystery, but also familiar. Yeah. At the same time, you know? And like, I'll go, oh, does his face look like home to me? you know, and yet there's like some kind of otherness about that too. So it's that sort of wonderful combination that, you know, whenever you find that, it's great.
Mm-hmm. That's really well put. The balance of mystery
Mm-hmm.
and the familiar, because I have heard similar stuff about chemistry,
Mm-hmm.
where, yeah, like I think the thing that I'm fond of quoting is this one podcast that was like, you want to find someone who's a 10 on compatibility, that's like shared values and all that.
Right, of course.
But then you want someone who's like a 7 on chemistry. So like, obviously if you can have a 10-10, awesome. Yeah. But they're saying if you have to choose between 10 chemistry, 7 compatibility versus 10 compatibility, 7 chemistry,
mm-hmm.
like it's better to go 7 chemistry, 10 compatibility.
Yeah. And it goes without saying, obviously, like those boxes of shared values,
Mm-hmm.
share, you know, have the same, like, same beliefs about God and faith and virtue. Obviously, we know all that has to be there. We're
Right.
not saying that chemistry is more important than those things, but it does matter.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I didn't mean to frame that in a way where I say chemistry doesn't matter.
You didn't. I'm just saying, you know.
Yeah. Coming back to that point, I 100% agree. Mm. Like, I sort of had that 7 chemistry, 10 compatibility mindset for a while. And like, without going into too much detail, I pursued relationships longer than I probably should have. Mm. Because I was like, well, you know, chemistry is kind of an adolescent thing.
Okay.
And that's a lie. It's real. Mm-hmm. And it matters. Now, I do think that it's important, coming back to our emotions and that balance with logic. It's like you got to have both heads in the room at the same time. Because if it's all emotion, that's going to go south real quick.
Right.
But if it's all logic, it's going to be like, okay, we're eating dry toast for the next 50 years. Great.
Till death do us part.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Oh my gosh. So something else that is really interesting in here is leaving room for that game and that dance and that flirtation. And I feel like playing with this idea of the familiar and the mysterious is really interesting. So let's unpack the mysterious first.
Did you just give me a rock on?
I'm doing this instead of rock on.
Got it.
Because this is horns. This is like,
okay.
And so I'm doing this instead.
Got it. You learned that at the EDM festival?
Yeah, no. But I learned a lot of, oh my gosh. Yeah. If you're ever considering going to an EDM festival.
I'm not.
Yeah. Probably wise. But if you're like, I'm a very curious person.
Yeah.
And I appreciate novelty. That's another thing too, in like the romanced by God space, just briefly circling back to that, where it's like, oh, this is different. Ooh, this is strange. And it plays into mystery too.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why I sought out this festival. I was like, this is not something I would normally do, but I am getting more into electronic music. I'm going with my brother and his wife. I'm sure I'm not going to see eye to eye with everybody at this place, which I did not. There was a lot of sin there. But I still appreciated the experience.
Totally. There's such value in being a curious person. Like, have curiosity about the world. Be intellectually curious. I think that's a trait that seems rarer and rarer and rarer. Like, intellectual curiosity. I'm not saying you've got to, you know, be a Mensa member, but just be curious about the world and curious to learn about new subjects, new experiences, people, you know?
Yeah. Before we like really dive into mystery, like within the dating process, what stops people from being curious? Like, how do, like, because it sounds so simple.
Low IQ. I'm kidding.
Wow. If you're dumb, sorry. Like, you're done.
No, I think, well, it goes back to the distraction thing. You know, the more that we have this phone in our hand, the more we scroll on social media, we're just making ourselves like meaner and dumber, you know? So it's like, allow silence to, you know, enter into your life. Like, allow room for curiosity instead of just like watching endless television, or or just that having that constant noise in your life, because it's like it's active. We have to choose to be curious about people and things,
and then exert effort to like explore those things.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. It comes back to that idea of like stimulus, where if I'm constantly stimulated and there's no room, I'm using my head as a bucket. If there's no room in the bucket, there's no room for new experiences. It's all the stuff that I know before that's kind of just bouncing around in like this echo chamber, versus if I pour some of that out, meaning if I create silence, like you said, suddenly there's room for, I've never made baguettes before. I wonder what that's like. And then you dive into that and you realize, wow, this is fun. This is new. This is different.
Yeah. And maybe you do it and you go, I never want to do that again. It's fine. I like to bake. You don't have to.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. You go. Yeah. Tell me about like, and I feel like this ties in really well to dating too, where it's like that mystery. Because I feel like, because you were talking about, or we were talking about earlier about people being products, and I love that idea. And I feel like a lack of curiosity hurts us in the dating space too, because we sort of look at somebody and it's like, well, I know what this person's about.
Right, yeah.
But like, if we create room for curiosity, suddenly we allow like mystery into the equation. Yeah. It's like, what is this?
And like allowing people to surprise you. How amazing is it when you sort of have an idea of a person, and then you find out, like, whoa, he's not what I expected, and in a good way. Sometimes people can surprise you in a negative way, but sometimes they surprise you in a really good way. And I think, allowing room for mystery, it's that sort of otherness. Like, men and women, we're very different, despite what current culture tries to tell us. We're very different, obviously, in our physicality, but also, the way that we communicate, the way we handle problems, the way, the way we navigate friendships and relationships. And it is that compatibility in the way that we balance one another out in the most beautiful, incredible way that is so designed by God, that when we really lean into our femininity and our masculinity, that then creates that mystery for the other, and then whenever you do find the person that you marry, how beautiful that you get to know and uncover the mystery of this person over time, as you grow in your companionship and you grow your life together. It's just so beautiful that it's like the more that we lean into the things that God has given us, the more we get to delight in that mystery.
Oh, I see. So it's like, as a man, for example, if I lean more into my masculinity, suddenly there's like that polarity.
Yeah.
Where suddenly the feminine seems more mysterious and yet more enticing at the same time. Where it's like, wait a second, hold on. Like, I've sort of processed things in this way. What's going on? Like, I don't, but that's really, it's like a very interested, like, whoa.
Yeah.
Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. There's, so, the most recent adaptation of Little Women came out like a couple years ago.
But I know the story.
Yeah. There's this great scene in it where, the girls all go over to their neighbor's house and only men live there. And they sort of rush in this like flood of noise and color and chatter, and they kind of like mill around the room, and then they leave, and then the men are standing there sort of like with these dazed looks on their faces and their hair kind of blown back. And I was like, that is it. Like that, that polarity where it's like, oh, this is other, like this is different from me, and it's part of how we learn and grow, because as a woman, like, I'm very feminine in my thinking and the way that I handle decisions and everything, so that I have to step back, when it comes to men, and go, wait, like, he's communicating very differently. He's handling this problem very differently. And it forces me to become curious about him and to go, okay, am I perceiving this correctly? Maybe I'll communicate and ask a question and find out.
Yeah. I like I like the idea of communication. I do want to put a
Mhm.
pin in that and come back to it, but it's like that difference in perception
Yeah.
is really real. It's like, I know it sounds kind of elementary to say it, but like men and women look at things very, very differently.
And how great is
And how
that?
beautiful is
Yeah.
that? I remember I was at the Nashville Palace with my friends Mike and Angelica. What's up, Mike and Angelica? How's it going? Um, Not too long ago, and I like I'm learning how to dance, Katie,
Oh,
over the past maybe year and a half.
congratulations.
Hey, thanks. It's
Yeah.
fun.
How's it going?
It's pretty good.
Okay.
I'm much better now than I was when I started, which
Okay.
is what we aim for. And at the same time, like, you know, comparison's a thing. It's really easy to look at the guys who are like really good leads
Mm-hmm.
and are showing like, and that's the other thing too, like to be able to give that to somebody is something that I'd like to do, where it's like,
Mhm.
I know all these moves and I'm going to show you a good time, things like that. But I was having trouble asking someone to dance this one time we went to the Palace because I was like, I'm not that good of a dancer, and I don't want to inflict bad dancing on somebody because like I'm like anyway. So I'm standing there and I sort of say exactly that to Angelica,
Mm-hmm.
and Angelica looks at me and goes, Matt, there are women standing around this floor just waiting for one guy to ask them.
Yep.
There are women out here tonight who will not get asked.
Yep.
They will stand here for like 2 hours and they will not get asked.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a total mindset shift. I was like, oh, well, in that case,
Yeah.
we got to do something.
Did you ask someone to dance?
Oh, I for sure did.
Good.
Yeah. And like I needed that mindset
Yeah.
shift to sort of, so that's how a woman would look at this situation.
Mm-hmm.
Versus like as a man, I'm very much like performance oriented. Like
Completely.
like if I you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
if I screw this up, then I've somehow failed her.
But also, what's the worst that could happen in that scenario? That's sometimes a helpful exercise, just playing out, okay, what is the worst possible outcome? Can I handle it if that happens?
Yeah.
And then just go for it. But,
Yeah.
you know, dancing is kind of a perfect metaphor. Like men and women, we have different roles to play, but we're still doing the same dance.
Mm-hmm.
But we move about the floor very differently. But
Yeah.
in time with each other.
Say more about that, because I feel like the dance metaphor in particular is really effective.
Yeah. Well, I think also at the beginning of a dating relationship, like that dance is part of the fun, you know? And sometimes in religious community, I think we can get a little bit too regimented. You know what I mean? We've talked about this before just in our friend group where it's like, okay, I am pursuing you. Here's date 1. That went very well. Shall we go for a coffee for date 2? Like, you know what I mean? And it's just like, are we in a study group or are you trying to date me? You know, it's
right.
like, so that sort of flirtation and play and that sort of push and pull at the beginning, that's fun, you know? And if we can lean into that a little bit more, like, that's something to really delight in.
Mm-hmm.
Like we talked about, like having that crush, it's wonderful and terrible at the same time.
Yeah. What does it look like? Because I agree with you, and what I don't want to do is like end this conversation and be like, well, that was great, I'm gonna keep doing. It's funny that you say like I'm going to ask you out and I will then a coffee date for the next day. It's funny that you put it that way, because that's literally the conversation I have with like friends of mine who are guys who are like looking to date. What do you think is the right approach in this situation? What is the strategy? What's the sequence of dates?
Yeah.
And I do think
it's good to be intentional, you know? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But have some fun once you get there.
The ambiguity and like the sort of gray space. What does it look like? Like we sort of touched on it earlier, and I'm circling back to an original point or just an earlier point. Like I feel like flirting is part of that equation.
Yeah.
And what does it look like to sort of show up in that dance?
I mean, I think for women, given the state of our society now, we kind of have to be on guard, right? We have to be physically guarded, we have to be emotionally guarded. And so having that posture of openness and receptivity is a big part of it too, and understanding that like our femininity, we've talked about this before, like our femininity can be a gift or a weapon. Like, you know, and I think in the way that men and women sort of sometimes today feel like ships passing in the night. I feel for you guys. You've grown up in an era of, the future is female and masculinity is toxic. And if I never hear that phrase again for the rest of my life, it'll be too soon, right? Because masculinity is not toxic. That's a beautiful thing that we have masculinity and femininity. And that, so I think for women, it's us sort of being in a posture of receptivity and openness and softness, and for men, that posture of of pursuit, but it's something as simple as oh my gosh, make eye contact, maybe even smile a little. So there's that, they think they're every time I see this in a modern movie or something, they always think it's so clever, women are sick of being told to smile, or so what? Smile. It's a gift,
Yeah.
You're giving the gift of your softness and tenderness to, whoever is in front of you. And when it comes to flirtation, that's a gift, and I think it is just, make eye contact, smile, be playful, you can poke fun a little bit. And that's it's like being on a playground, if he pokes fun at you, he probably likes you.
And that's flirting, isn't it? To some extent.
I think so. And it just depends on the person too. But it's just a state of openness, we're all so guarded all the time, eyes on our phone all the time. Put the phone down, look at the people in the room around you, and just have show up. I think that's half of flirting too. It's just show up,
That I think you hit the nail on the head, especially with that last statement where it's yes, it's good to talk about things like smiling and being playful and being open, and those are all really good things, but I think it starts with just show up.
Yeah.
Go to a thing where there's the potential to meet somebody and then make an effort to just interact with people. If you, I'm not saying that you should do exactly this, but if the choice is between me sitting in my room reading a book and me going to a game night or an event or something like that, and walking into every conversation with my arms sort of if it's between those two, I would much rather do this because at least I'm there.
Yeah.
At least I'm showing up. Now there's obviously the additional nuance of be open, be playful, use the skills that you've got, but then also this is a gray area. I can't control this thing. That's something I need to hear really often. It doesn't matter how well or how poorly I show up. I've had great nights when I've shown up absolutely fried. Just I have nothing in the tank. I don't know what to talk about, but this was a great night. How did that happen? And then I've had nights when I'm okay, I know what my game plan is. I feel rested. I had a good dinner and I got nothing.
Yeah. Well, it's also just being in tune with yourself and knowing what you need, because some days you do need those nights at home with a book to recharge, and but say yes, just practice a habit of saying yes. And the more that we can remind ourselves, because we all have our vulnerabilities and insecurities, we're all walking around with these wounded egos in some way, shape, or form, but just recognize that everyone has that, and that, the stakes are ridiculously low to just go into a room with, an open heart, an open mind, and back to giving the best of yourself to people, leaving people better than you found them.
Yeah. Say more about the stakes being really low, because I agree with you.
Yeah.
I just want to hear you expand on that.
I think when we get in I definitely am guilty of doing this. When I let something spin around and around and around in my head, I'm this is such a huge deal, and when it comes to dating, someone new, it's do I send this text message? You sit around waiting for the text to come in, and sometimes just text him. It's not a big deal. And I say this because friends have had to coach me in this way. Katie, would you relax? Just send a text message. It's not a big deal, And so don't text him 25 times, right?
Right. Right.
But sometimes you can just send the message, and that goes for men and women. Obviously, be aware of and pay attention to how the other person is engaging with you or responding, because it goes back to, it is a dance, you know, but sometimes we have to remember that this person that we like, you know, that is, you know, that has sparked our interest, like maybe they don't know if you like them, you know, and if they find out, what's the worst that can happen? They like you back or not. And then you're one step closer to finding your person.
Yeah, because either in a small margin of cases, that person is going to like you back and it's going to be awesome. You two get married, have kids, all that good stuff. But then in the other, and I'd hate to say this, like, but it's the reality. The other person doesn't like you back, or like maybe you talk for a while and it's not a good match. But even that, like you said, is progress.
Yeah.
Even that is like, I engaged with this person who I felt an interest in, and this is where it got me. And I'm not gonna sit around and be because it wasn't what I wanted.
Right. And it's and this is more in the feminine, like being in that state of receptivity. But being receptive for both men and women, being receptive to God's will and making sure that you're discerning and going like, am I trying to control the outcome here, or am I seeing clearly? You know? That can be difficult as well. Like, seeing clearly in the midst of all of that. Is your vision being clouded by your own goals and desires? Is your vision being clouded by your own insecurity? And just being able to separate that voice in our head, like, what is truth and what is a lie? And sometimes, you know, that involves counsel with good friends. Not everyone you meet, right? Like, you don't need to go sharing your business with everyone, but counseling with a couple good friends and help people who know you really well, who can help you see more clearly.
That's, I'm glad that you brought it around to that. Like, having people that you know well in this process is such a gift. Because, like, it is really important to see things objectively. It is really important to say, oh, I have this sort of pattern where I do X, Y, Z, and it's not helpful. It's not serving me. And having people who can call those things out in you in a loving way, people who can like share in that depth of you in this process, are so good for keeping you grounded. Because, I mean, just in college, for example, I kind of was operating under the assumption that I need to have all of the answers, and I can't ask anyone for help, because if I do, I'm admitting weakness, or I'm admitting that I suck at this, and I can't be vulnerable to a woman that I'm speaking with on a date. I can't be like, I don't know what to say here. Like, I can't say that. Like, it's on me to keep the conversation rolling.
Right. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. That's it.
Well, and just to give yourself grace, there's a difference between having all of the answers and being intentional. You talk about men wanting to know, like, how do they approach women? Intentionality is huge. Honesty and intentionality, and something that, you know, I look for, that I think a lot of women look for, is, do the words and actions match? You know, are the things that he's saying, are they being proven true in action and behavior? And that's, you know, again, that's tough to navigate whenever it's new. But we're all just doing our best.
Yeah, it's an imperfect science.
Yeah.
And it's an imperfect dance, and like, we're gonna step on each other's toes sometimes. But I actually heard Father Gregory Pine say this once, where it's like, yeah, my intentions might not be perfect, and that's part of what I think stops me sometimes. And maybe it's same for other guys, but it's like, ooh, like, do I genuinely like her? What are my intentions here? And you sort of get like, and I think guys are aware of that, which is a good thing. But I feel like if your intentions are like 70% good or 80% good, and then the other 20% is something that's between you and God that you're still working out, I think that's, you still got to show up.
Yeah. And understand that, you know, there are extenuating circumstances in people's lives. Like, someone can be intentional, and a guy can be intentional and mean what he says, but maybe work is really busy, or he's got a health issue or a family issue, you know? So we also have to give people grace and not hold people up to these impossibly have standards, of course,
Mm-hmm.
for, you know, the treatment you're willing to accept, the things that you value, your non-negotiables, of course have standards, but
Mm-hmm.
understand that, you know, when I'm looking for a husband, that husband is going to model himself after Jesus, but he's not Jesus, and he's never going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, so it's just, you know, we look to Jesus, we look to Our Lady for us as women, you know, as the example for how to be those sort of graceful conduits of peace and love.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where we're striving for sainthood, you know, we're not
Mm-hmm.
there. We're just always reaching for it. So we've got to have grace for the other when our humanity reveals our imperfections.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I especially love that you called out Our Lady in that process as well.
Mm-hmm.
I went to confession not too long ago, and I think for guys, I think it's also important to have a devotion to Our Lady as well.
Mm.
I feel like the fiat thing,
Yeah.
like yes, we're protectors and we're providers and we set vision and we go after the thing and all that good stuff. But I also feel like as human beings, we need to learn from Mary's fiat, where it's like, God, let your will be done in this circumstance.
Yeah.
Like, would you use me? Would you pour out your spirit upon me so I can show up in this circumstance the way that you want me to? And then trust how I show up as being your will. That's the other scary thing too, because like I might have an idea of how I want an interaction to go. And then I go have that interaction and it's different from what I wanted. I'm like, this can't be right. This is not right.
This is not the way I scripted it.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. But it's God's will.
Yeah. Yeah. And the will of the other person. You know, you have to accept what other people offer to you. You can't control other people. You can't control the outcome.
Mm.
You can only control how you approach the circumstances in which you find yourself. Yeah.
100%. So how do we show up for each other just in general? Like, I know we've talked a lot about, I'm interested in this person, I'm going to go speak with them. But just for those friends of ours that we see consistently, like, how do we show up for one another in this space? Because I feel like respecting the dignity of the human person goes beyond just the people that we're interested in. And I know that's kind of an obvious thing to say. What are your thoughts there?
I think showing up with intentionality and men and women practicing lifting each other up, you know, like we talked about femininity being a gift or a weapon. Like, so our femininity can be used to manipulate or belittle men, but understanding that we as women have been given a gift. And so when we model ourselves after Our Lady and we lead with our softness and our tenderness, but also her quiet strength, you know, and her dignity, we can lift men up in that way, you know. And something as simple as like, and sometimes it takes a conscious effort to sort of step back and be in the receptive, you know, let the guy open the door for you. And when he does, comment on it. Tell him thank you. Say, I really appreciate that. Like that's so rare now.
Yeah.
I mean, every time I take a flight, I overpack because I know I'm just going to make eye contact with some guy on the plane, like, and he's going to offer to lift my bag, and I'm going to make a thing of it and tell him what a gentleman he is, you know.
Okay.
And even today at Mass, like a little boy held the door open for me, and I told him, "Well, thank you. You're such a gentleman." Like, we can lift men up in that way, and I think we as women need to recognize, again, back to like, you guys live in a world that tells you masculinity itself is toxic and wrong. And we have to provide a counter narrative to that lie. And our femininity is a gift that can call men to be their higher selves, like to be those protectors and providers. And part of that when it comes to dating is having a standard, you know, and making that clear, not in terms of like, I want to go to this 5-star restaurant or nowhere else, but just in terms of, you know, communicating to men like, hey, I think you're a good guy, you know, and not saying it directly, but here's the standard for how I would like to be treated and communicated with, because, you know, there's so many people who are lost and desperate for love, who are willing to accept far less and who are willing to deny the truth of their own dignity, just for for companionship, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, and how do men, like, it, guys, it's so nice when you open the door or offer to, you know, grab a bag for a woman in those small ways. And you're going to open the door for women who will walk through it and not say thank you, but just understand she's not reflective of so many others who are waiting for the guy to ask them to dance. You know? Like,
yeah. I feel like we've kind of come full circle in some ways to this idea of like creating the culture that you want, or like supporting the culture that you want. And I think this idea of encouragement is particularly powerful in that, oh my gosh, there's so many angles and there's so many things that we like, so many ways to sort of look at this. Like it's one thing to, like, I understand wanting to guard one's heart and not lead people on. And that, I think, is sometimes what stops those interactions from happening.
Right.
In addition to the lies that we're told, like, I can't open a door for her because she might think I'm interested. Oh, I can't say thank you to him for opening the door because he might think I'm interested. But there's like, the stakes aren't that high.
No.
Like, we're being kind to each other because like we're human beings. And to borrow something that you said earlier, where it's like, just be in the moment, be present to people, and like leave room for that mystery, and understand that like this is all part of it. Like those interactions of those gestures that we do for each other, where we're receptive or we're protective, or guy opens a door, walks a lady to her car, a lady smiles or something like that. It's all part of the dance.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean one thing or another, but these are things that, in a sense, we kind of owe each other because we're like made in God's image and likeness, and we all have dignity as a person. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think like we're shaping who we're going to be tomorrow. You know, the husband that you're going to be one day, the father you're going to be one day, that's going to be the culmination of how you have shown up every single day prior. What kind of friend you are, what kind of son you are, what kind of brother you are. And in all of these relationships in our lives, when we prioritize the dignity of the human person, like, we're practicing who we're going to become. You know, we show up for our family and our friends as a way of preparing ourselves for the vocation, you know, and how to show up for our spouse. But yeah, I think be the woman or man you want to be today. Like, start today.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, where it's like, if I'm going to be an effective husband, for example, I need to be courageous. I have to be, because what happens when I've got like the family at home and some, I don't know, left-winger comes to the door and is trying to sell my family on some like liberal ideology, or we interact with someone in public and I don't have that courage skill built, they're just going to walk right over the wall. They're going to walk right over the wall into the city and burn it to the ground. I'm being kind of extreme, but like, that's what's at stake. And so there's more, there's less at stake in each interaction than we think there is. Like, oh, what does this opening the door mean? But there actually is more to each interaction, in terms of, like, to your point, who are we becoming over time? What are we practicing? What are the buckets that we're investing in? Like, it's not just a matter of, I need to be courageous because I would like to find my spouse, and I need to be courageous in this interaction in order to do that. It's like, I need to be courageous because my family needs a courageous father and husband.
Yep. And because you're made in the image and likeness of God. You know, you're made, you know, you're called to be courageous because you're created with dignity. And that, you know, courage is one of the rarest virtues, I think. Courage is hard. Yeah.
Requires exposure to potential suffering, potential discomfort, disappointment.
Yeah, but suffering leads us to meaning and purpose.
Yeah, that's right. It's the only way.
Yep.
Oh, this is so good.
This is so fun, Matthew.
This is so good. I feel like we've covered some awesome ground. We've talked a little bit about the decline of dignity in our culture and how we show up counterculturally to that. We talked a little bit about allowing ourselves to be romanced by Jesus and creating space in our lives for curiosity and just space in general for him to operate. We've talked about dating, being uplifting to one another, respecting the dignity, and then also appreciating just the dance and the sort of gray area. Is there anything that's still on your heart that you want to share with our listeners? Anything that's still top of mind?
Yeah, and I think the more that we can just focus on giving the best of ourselves to people, lifting each other up, and just approaching other human beings with that open heart.
And then letting God take care of the rest.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you for being part of this, Katie.
Thanks, Matthew. This is fun. We've got the birds singing in the background. The sun's going down. Nice.
Yeah. Always a vibe. Thanks again.
Thank you.